Hello and welcome. Welcome to today's training about compensation foundations. We're going to be learning about the obligations and best practices in your organization surrounding compensation. My name's Linda Addy. I'm a training and development consultant here in Portland, Oregon, with the consultancy HR Annie Consulting. You can find us at www.hrannieconsulting.com, and you are very welcome to follow us on Instagram, follow us on LinkedIn, or go to our website, click on Contact Us, and go ahead and sign up for our free newsletter so that you can receive push notifications of upcoming employment law changes, best practices, compliance pro tips, and certainly so much awareness about how to take care of your people. Today's map. This is what we're going to talk about today. You're going to learn the difference between the categorization of your employees versus an independent contractor. We're also going to talk about the difference between compensation for your employees versus reimbursement for your employees or other members in your organization. And then we're going to talk too about considerations for board members, some awareness and some shared knowledge and kind of that frequent recurring conversation we can have to ensure that incoming board members are aware of their roles and responsibilities. And then in each of these sections of learning, I am going to share out some pro tips in the work. Please be aware that employment laws may vary and they do change, not only at a federal level, but in the state of Oregon. Additionally, it could be a change in your locality to include your county where you do business or where you operate, where your organization supports the community. There are also some employment law changes that may pertain specifically to your industry or even to your organization's size. And by organization size, I mean number of an employee. So just have that awareness as we're moving through some of this learning that laws may change and they may vary according to your specific makeup in your organization. Well, let's go ahead and get started with our first learning. There is a difference between an employee and an independent contractor. And so in the left-hand column here, let's go ahead and learn this difference. Employees typically are working hours that are set by the employer. Employees are also likely to be a longer term hire. So we're hoping when we hire right the first time that that employee who sees the essential functions of the job, that they have the skills, experience, and expertise to do it. And hopefully we retain them, we keep them satisfied in their role, and that they could even be with us for a very, very long time, if not indefinitely. Employees also are going to have access to employer supplies that can vary depending on what your organization does. And so typically the employer is purchasing and distributing some of those supplies. An employee also is someone in the organization who is enjoying employer perks. So that could be specific to medical, dental, vision benefits. It may be something different in terms of free parking or, access to promotions in the organization, bonuses, things like that. So an employee is someone who would enjoy all of those benefits that by design you are offering to someone who you've hired and are retaining. And then last, an employee is someone who is going to be paid typically within your payroll schedule. And payroll schedules can change. So whatever your payroll schedule is, whether it's weekly, every 2 weeks, or monthly, in Oregon, you need to make sure that you at least are paying folks every 35 days. So an employee is someone who is considered, part of the team. They're doing the work with you, and they're on that payroll schedule. Now, differently, an independent contractor is someone who typically would set their own hours and they may even decline hours. So if you have a relationship with someone who is not an employee, they're not on your payroll, they aren't enjoying those employer perks and benefits, a contractor is someone who's saying, oh, you've got 10 hours for me, great. I'm going to choose to accept those hours and do the work. Or instead, they may say, hey, I'm too busy or I have another commitment with another client. I'm unable to accept those 10 hours. A contractor also is typically someone who is just working with you or serving whatever that scope of work may be that you've agreed upon for a specific amount of time. It's rare where it's just indefinite. It's not impossible, but typically the organization would know, hey, we need a contractor for this particular project or for this season. And a contractor also is someone that typically would provide their own supplies. So differently, an employee might be given a laptop to use that is owned by the organization. And if the employee were to leave the organization, they would return that laptop. An independent contractor would likely bring in their own laptop or their own supplies in order to complete the work they've been hired to do. So differently from an employee, also, a contractor can be viewed really as someone who is acting as their own in their own business. So they are subject to their own self-employment taxes. They may not have you as their only client or their only job that they have. They may serve others in their project work. An example in nonprofits might be maybe you need some additional support with grant writing. You don't need someone who's with you for the entirety of the year or even for the next, long-term 3 to 5 years. You just need someone for the next season. And so you might hire someone as an independent contractor who is helping you with the grant writing projects in front of you, and they may actually be doing that for some other organizations as well. And then the last piece here would be that a contractor is different than an employee and that they would usually not be paid with the payroll schedule. They would be paid separately according to the scope of work that you've agreed upon. So it could be that, once the deliverables are received, then the contractor is paid. It could be that they've asked you for a certain frequency of when they're paid, be it weekly or monthly. So you may think of a contractor more like a vendor. So someone where you are receiving goods and services, they invoice you, and then you are paying them. So hopefully that clarifies the difference between these two categorizations of those that may help you to accomplish your mission and reach your goals. An employee is someone who really is part of that long-term team. There's someone that is going to be paid according to the payroll schedule. They get to enjoy all those benefits. And a contractor could say, hey, I don't want to work this week, or you've asked me to take on 20 hours. Actually, I only want to take on 10. They would use their own supplies. Typically, they're going to be short term or kind of intermittent. Maybe you use them on occasion, and they would be paid more so as a vendor. One awareness I want to share with you is a federal law called the Fair Labor Standards Act. And so when we're thinking about employees, I want to make sure that you're aware that there really is, under wage and hour law, exemptions of those that don't have to be, calculated with overtime, and those that absolutely have to be. And if you're unsure of kind of this test of like, well, who could be considered exempt from overtime and who would be non-exempt, you can go to the Bureau of Labor and Industries or seek some HR consultation, and we can help you in terms of knowing exactly which employees can be paid salary and which employees really would not be considered for that salary amount. The other thing I want to share with you is that there are some recent updates. So as of April 23rd of 2024, the U.S. Department of Labor has announced a final rule. And assuming that there are no legal challenges, what we'll see is effective July 1st of 2024, the minimum salary level will actually increase to $844 a week. And those changes can happen on occasion, right? Kind of what I said earlier as a disclaimer in this training is that employment laws can change and they can vary according to your industry, according to your size. So in this case, if you are paying someone's salary at this time, if they actually should be being paid salary and not hourly, where with hourly, your employees would need overtime calculated. And in the state of Oregon, that's at 1.5 or 1.5 times their hourly rate. If you are paying someone's salary, just know that those minimum salary levels are in fact changing here shortly. What are your obligations in compensation and also in hiring employees? Well, it's important that you know that as those that are in leadership or in management or supervisory roles, it's important that you keep employees free from severe harm, that you're maintaining a respectful workplace free from harassment and discrimination. If you're hiring an employee, you are on the hook to make sure that they are able to work in the US. And so you would be having that employee complete an I-9 where they would demonstrate that they can work in the US, and you would complete that form within 3 days. And then you also would want to make sure that in that leadership role or supervisory role of managing people who are your employees, that you're providing any employee entitlements that you should be. This is an important compliance piece. And so be it rest breaks, that calculation of overtime, allowing folks to enjoy their sick time entitlement, their paid leave entitlement, family leave, Oregon family leave specifically, or medical leave, and also potentially having conversations about accommodations. These are all things that you need to do as an employer. Now, if you currently don't have employees, what you can do too is you can go to the Secretary of State to learn about obtaining federal and state tax ID numbers, obtaining workers' compensation insurance, and really understanding how to file withholding and unemployment taxes once you hire your first round of employees. If you're an organization who's aware of a worker who is undocumented or a worker who's unable to provide you with what I mentioned, that verification information that verifies that they do have authorization to work in the US, you may want to seek consult from either an employment attorney or just be made aware of the pathways to support that worker to get the proper documentation and or awareness of possible fines and penalties the organization may face if you don't have an I-9 that is on file. So hopefully that helps you to see clearly that if you are an organization that does have an employees, it is your role to make sure that the employees are safe, that they're able to work authentically as themselves in a welcoming, inclusive environment, that you are doing your diligence in being compliant with the federal law of verifying that they can work. In the event you have an employee who is unable to provide you with that verification, there may be some pathways you want to take with awareness and consultation, and then certainly making sure that you are aware of the employee entitlements that exist in your locality and in your state. There are so many great resources for you. As I mentioned, if you're new to just starting to hire employees, or you're considering or know that you'll be doing that in the near future, be sure you check out the Secretary of State's website to see some guidance there. There's some really great things you can print out so that you can kind of check the boxes of what you need to do and where you need to register. The Bureau of Labor and Industry is also a really lovely resource for you in terms of, which end is up for employment law and compliance. So you can go to BOLI, just kind of Google that and make sure that it's Oregon specific in order to see specifically for employers what you need to be aware of. Other resources include the Department of Labor. You may be aware of a really wonderful organization called NAO, which will help you in decisions you're making, board governance, fundraising, all types of wonderful things. And then there is additionally HR Consult or legal or other consult that can help you as you navigate managing your teams. Let's talk about some pro tips in kind of this overarching category of employees versus contractors, okay? What I would recommend to you is making sure that folks have, even if it's pretty concise or succinct, just some job descriptions. What are employees expected to do? What are their essential functions? What skills should they have in order to be considered for that role? And also making sure that job descriptions are available to your supervisors. That can be really great for performance management and any conversations that may come up if an employee is injured on the job, if an employee requests a leave, and upon return from leave, we can look at that job description and really see what are the physical requirements of the job, and we can kind of have a clear conversation versus one that feels a little unsteady or unsure. Additionally, I would recommend, it's not required, but it really comes down to open communication where there's high levels of understanding. With contractors, I would suggest some type of scope of work. So what is the contractor being hired to do, for how long? When will that person be paid potentially? What are the deliverables? And that really helps you to, drive your goals or strategies to that finish line during that period of time where you are engaging with an independent contractor. One thing I want to share too about those that you hire that are independent contractors, keeping in mind that, you know, they are their own self business, right? They are an employee. They're separate from the employee group. You can absolutely make sure that your contractors are aware of your core values, your expectations surrounding respectful workplace, you know, any of those types of how should you act and behave and care for folks when you are in the workplace, you know, conducting any project work or, you know, working with the employees. It's likely that your contractors sometimes work side by side or on projects with your employees, and you can share out what your expectations of behavior are for those contractors. Well, let's move to talking about compensation and reimbursement and those differences. So compensation is monetary and sometimes non-monetary benefits that an employee receives in exchange for their work and their services to an organization. So compensation for an employee is employee earnings, right? It's what I make either annually as a salary or hourly. It may include, of course, deductions for taxes, and it may include deductions for garnishments or perhaps an insurance premium that I'm responsible for as an employee. Now, very different from compensation, right? Compensation is monetary or non-monetary that applies to an employee because they have worked or completed work or services. Reimbursement is different, and reimbursement usually references a policy. Reimbursement usually requires a receipt or a proof of reimbursement, the proof that the reimbursement was needed or authorized. And it may require some type of approval. It could even include in your policy some type of cap. So reimbursement is that act of compensating someone for expenses that they've incurred or money that they've spent on behalf of someone else or for work-related purposes. So hopefully this is very clear to you that compensation as a word is I have worked this many hours or I am completing this role full-time or part-time, and during the payroll cycle I am being compensated for my wages and also whatever those benefits are that I'm enjoying or those perks that I'm enjoying. Separately, reimbursement is more transactional, and it could be that an employee or a supervisor or even a board member, you know, does a quick run over to Office Depot and is picking up a case of paper. And typically that person who's picking up the paper paid for the paper with their own cash or debit card or credit card, and then they're able to deliver the item, the paper, and with a receipt can show that, yep, I paid $50 for this paper, and then they could submit that. And that's where your policy comes in. Likely you could have a procedure that says, hey, all of your expenses need to be in by the 15th of the month, and it needs to be a receipt that is legible, or it needs to be a photocopy. You can decide what that looks like in terms of how it's managed, and then just make sure that with, a good best practice would be with a sense of urgency to reimburse that person who, incurred, some type of debt or, they paid for it and the organization owes it back to them. We don't want that to be drawn out where potentially it could feel negative or even pose some type of hardship or burden to the person who went out and paid for that expense for the organization. So if you don't have a policy in regards to reimbursement, you can check with an HR consultant or check in with NAO. And I do have some pro tips coming up in the next few slides of some considerations for how to build out a reimbursement policy that is fair and equitable and makes sense. And everybody can kind of follow the track of exactly how things should be expensed and in what time frame. When it comes to compensation compliance, I do want to make you aware that you must pay on a schedule. There needs to be some type of consistency where the employee knows, okay, I'm going to get paid every 2 weeks, or I get paid on the 5th of the month and on the 20th of the month, or whatever that may look like to you. And then for compliance in the state of Oregon, you want to make sure that your employees are getting paid at least every 35 days, if not sooner. Another compliance awareness for you is that you must provide an itemization of the earnings and the deductions for your employees. So We likely have all experienced this where you get paid and you have some type of paycheck stub, right? You can look and see how many hours did you work? Were there any entries for, maybe some type of stipend that you experience and are receive as part of compensation, or maybe vacation that you took for your paid leave. It could also include, of course, all of the taxes or deductions so that I have, as your employee, transparency and visibility of exactly which end is up in terms of how I'm getting rewarded to work with you. Also, it's important that you know if an employee is not going to be working with you in the future, the last paycheck needs to occur no later than the next business day if it is an involuntary separation. So if you're deciding that an employee can no longer work in the organization, you want to make sure that you have that paycheck for them no later than the next business day. There are some other rules and expectations and compliance that exist when the employee chooses to voluntarily separate from you. And so if they provide certain amounts of notice, you may still need to provide them with a check on that very last day that they work with you. And all of those details of when last paychecks are due and when you may have a little bit more grace and time without notice is available at BOLI, BOLI, in Oregon. Bureau of Labor and Industries. Another compliance piece here is that paychecks really should never include deductions for unreturned items. So let's say I'm your employee, you have distributed a laptop to me, I gave my notice, I gave you a 2 weeks notice, so you know exactly when my last day is going to be. And you write a check for me and you say, hey, because you didn't turn in your computer, I'm going to deduct the cost of the computer from your paycheck. You should not do that. So separate my earnings and wages and compensation and what you owe me as an entitlement. Make sure you're still providing that to me without any deductions. And that there are a couple of exceptions to that. If there was, for example, like some type of advance that I took, and then I signed that I understand that there could be a deduction from my final paycheck or from my next paycheck. But by and large, you really should avoid arbitrarily deciding that because I didn't turn in my jacket or, my clipboard or something like that, that you're going to deduct those items from my last paycheck. And then this probably makes sense to you because we all, have livelihoods and bills and most likely are paying a mortgage or have rent due somewhere, that when and if there's an error in compensation, I highly recommend that you put a really fast hop in your step and that those errors are reconciled or fixed just as soon as you can. I want to make you also aware of pay equity. So equity meaning fair, equal, consistent. In the state of Oregon, there are actually 8 factors in pay equity, uh, and those factors are pretty firm. There may be other factors that you consider, but by and large, employee A and employee B really should only have a difference in their rate of pay if they're working the exact same role. If one employee has more seniority, has demonstrated more merit, produces more quantity or quality of work, has kind of a more challenging workplace location, travels much in their job, has a higher level of education or training or experience. Those would really be the only reasons why one employee working the same job would be paid or compensated differently in wages on your payroll cycle than another employee. If you need help with understanding these bona fide factors, you can reach out to a wage analysis consultant. You can reach out to HR Annie. You can go to the BOLI website. But it's important that employee A wouldn't make more money than employee B just because employee A asks more often for a raise. Hopefully that makes sense. And as mentioned, I just want to give you a few thoughts to consider if you currently don't have a policy or procedure surrounding your reimbursement planning or communication. So I would just ask the question in terms of expense reporting, who is able to participate, who can submit an expense, an item that they need to be reimbursed for. What and how much is eligible. So you would want to make sure that just because I went out to the store and I saw something that looked like, oh, I bet we need this, that I wouldn't just buy it and then expect to be reimbursed. You would have some type of proactive communication about, hey, we need this item, who can pick it up? Please make sure that it's no more than $50 or $250 or whatever your budget or projection may be. It could be in your procedure and policy that you also want to make sure that someone has their hand in approving your reimbursement. So, who authorizes, who says, yes, you can submit this expense. The other would be, is there a due date? So what we don't want is it's the end of the year and I dig through my backpack and I try to submit 7 receipts from last January. That might really disrupt your ability to manage your dollars in your organization. It could be that some of those expenses actually aren't approved, or I shouldn't have purchased them because they weren't needed in the organization. And here I am expecting to be reimbursed for the expense that I paid. So I would encourage you to think about what are the due dates and, how is that communicated out? And then when will the reimbursement occur? So it could be that even if you don't have currently a handbook where this is kind of in there and available to the team and to everyone to kind of track along with, you can still communicate the policy. You could just kind of print something up or send out that global email and make sure you retain it so that everybody understands if you have an expense, here's step 1, step 2, step 3, and this is when you'll be reimbursed for the debt that you incurred so that you can release that debt and kind of get back to square one. And here are some pro tips when we're talking about compensation. Again, we just reviewed compensation versus reimbursement. When it comes to compensation, I would recommend making sure that you're as transparent as possible. So even in your job ad, while it's not currently a law in Oregon to list the range, of pay, I think that it's a great best practice to say, hey, here's the job, here's the role, here's the essential functions, these are the skills required to apply, and the general range is, this amount of money from, kind of whatever that wage range might be. It starts at 17 and could be upwards to 19 as an example. I would also be transparent about ways to grow in your organization. And if you do have any type of, with your payroll processing, awareness that folks tend to get paid, the Friday before a bank holiday, I would just make sure that everybody knows that, because we all work hard and, again, have livelihoods and bills and rent or a mortgage or things that we are saving for. And so just being transparent about the payroll schedule and ways to grow in the organization is really a great best practice. Knowing your wage bands is lovely too. And so, as I mentioned, within those bona fide factors for pay equity, I would make sure that you know that, hey, for this position, the starting wage is this, and for this fiscal year, the top wage, the ceiling wage is the other. And know that for each of your positions. This allows you to make sure that you are not biased in just because I'm the person that asks for an increase every 3 months, that you give it to me, or that maybe even you have without knowing it, a bit of bias of like who is a great performer and who is a not so great performer. And so you are kind of arbitrarily just giving out increases. We want to have a plan. We want to know the bands and we want to sync up to what those wage bands are. I also would encourage you to share compensation story. And so while compensation is absolutely earnings, it's the amount of time that you are contributing to the organization, whether you're paid salary or whether you're paid hourly, there's more to the story. It's not just the wage, likely. There's probably some other perks that could be shared out, whether that's health insurance, whether that's retirement, whether that's pet insurance, or you get a free gym membership, whatever is going on that you're able to provide to your employees. I would make sure that you are sharing out that larger story that goes beyond just the hourly rate or the annual salary. I also would use care and caution in, if you provide employees with benefits, you don't want to be in that situation where you have to take it away, because sometimes that can just have that feeling of just kind of the bitter taste in the mouth. Sometimes it's unavoidable just because of changes organizationally that need to happen, or budgeting that needs to happen, or trimming or slimming that needs to happen. But I would try to be really intentional when you're building out your benefits programs or the things that you want to give to your employees to celebrate their work and to celebrate and hopefully kind of build the retention of those employees. Try to be somewhat aware of that you can provide this benefit for a longer term of time versus just, hey, we can only do it for the next 3 months. Who knows if we can do it for the next 9? And then naturally, this will make sense to you that we don't want anybody to, not know when they're going to get paid, or if an error comes up that we don't know when we're going to get that secondary check that makes the math error correct, right? So if there is some type of snafu that happens, if someone points out an error, you want to be really, really, really quick to fix that error. And you want to be proactive with a sense of urgency in communicating whatever changes might be in front of you during that payroll cycle and payroll schedule. Now let's talk about some reimbursement pro tips. Similar to compensation, being transparent, when there's a plan and everybody can be aware of the plan, now we can work the plan. So if you have a reimbursement policy and procedure, you may need to just make sure that everybody is aware and on notice of what it is and how it works, that they have an opportunity to ask you for questions should they have them. You want to make sure that there certainly is a paper trail. So in your organization, if you ever were audited, for example, you want to make sure that you can show that, yep, we went to the store, we went to Office Depot, we bought $50 in paper, here's the receipt. And of course, the receipt would have the timestamp, it would have the dollar amount, and you likely would also have some documentation of who was reimbursed for that expense. And be consistent. You don't want to reimburse one person and not the other. So if someone makes an office run and you're asking them to do something, you want to just be fair and consistent that, what works for one person and what is reimbursed for one person would essentially be the same for someone else. And then similar to compensation, work with a sense of urgency. If someone is saying, hey, I took this money out of my personal bank or I put it on my personal credit card to allow to provide to pay for a service or an item for the organization, you want to get that reimbursement back to them with some type of sense of urgency in whatever your policy and procedure is for reimbursement where they're paid back. I want to share out too some best practices about board members. So hopefully you have some type of, documentation in your bylaws or governance about what are the responsibilities of board members. And I think that can include what are, their duties in the organization, what is your expectation of how often they should attend board meetings or their committee involvement, or kind of other things that are true and specific to you. It might not always be specific to another nonprofit, but specific to you. There may be an expectation depending on if someone is, a board chair or a fundraising chair or serving on some other committee or in some other role, what just that expectation of hours is. I would encourage you to make sure that you are having those conversations, and also from time to time reviewing your governance, like sharing out those bylaws with your board members so that it stays top of mind and with high awareness. And I think another great pro tip for your board member communication is just reminding them or sharing or even celebrating, like, why should they? Why would they join your board, right? Like, why should they work in this role? And in doing that, I think, there's also kind of that understanding of, is this a role that is compensated or is this a role that is voluntary? When we have these conversations about what is expected and what is clear about the role, then we can make sure that we are being fair, consistent, equitable, and we're avoiding any optics of, well, I do this for this board member, but I don't do it for the other. We don't want that to exist. We really want it to be as fair as possible. And then we want to be clear too about what would be discoverable. So to give you an example that ties the awareness and communication of board roles and reimbursement, you wouldn't want to say, hey, I am going to make sure that I give mileage to these 2 board members, but I'm not going to give mileage to someone else. That could potentially pose risk for the organization, right? Those optics could look like it's favoritism. And then if for some reason there was some type of concern and folks wanted to kind of peel back the curtain and they saw that, hey, these 2 folks were reimbursed, but the rest were not, that may pose a risk to you, right? It might be bad press. It could be board members being dissatisfied or feeling less than. So have an awareness of, the fact that when you communicate out not just board rules, but also your reimbursement policy and procedure, now everybody is aware and everybody can use those policies and procedures as a guide. Other considerations for you would be sometimes what happens is we have a lack of clarity about whether board member participation or contributions are paid roles or not. What I will share is that typically in the nonprofit world, when a board member fills a role, it's typically voluntary. And so again, that could be something that's shared on the front end in a proactive way when someone's considering joining your board, that they would know that, hey, it's a voluntary role. This is how many hours. This is our expectation. Would you like to join? Now, there could be some exceptions. So if a board member were compensated, it could be because there's a project that they're taking on that you normally would hire someone to do, and perhaps they have that expertise. It could be that the board member is able to provide you with some type of service or item that they create. I would be really clear and considerate as to whether there's a conflict of interest there or not. So you might need some HR or legal guidance in that realm. And then I will say one thing that could be true is that a board member might be compensated with wages, especially if they are stepping into a role that you would normally be paying someone for. So if maybe we have a particular director role and the director has resigned, or you're still hiring for that person and you need someone to fulfill certain roles and responsibilities, it could be that you're going to hire in an interim way or pay wages to a board member who's doing more than what they would normally do in their voluntary role. When you aren't sure, what can you do? When you're not sure, I would say, there's lots of resources in this slide deck and in this presentation where you could check in with Bureau of Labor and Industries or NAO. But when you're not sure, absolutely check in with your HR or legal consult so that you can make sure that you are staying above board, staying compliant, and avoiding any optics of potential bias or favoritism. There are some really fun ways where we can underscore and celebrate that board members do really amazing things for your organization. A personal thank you can apply, a public thank you could apply. Perhaps there's an internal award like Board Member of the Year or Quarter. There can be lots of fun appreciation events that are held by the organization and paid for by the organization. There can be anniversary acknowledgements. I think that's really nice. I actually serve on 2 nonprofit boards. If there's awareness of when a board member started and it is their 1-year anniversary or 6-month mark, or lo and behold, they've been in this role for 5 years and you can kind of throw out the confetti, those acknowledgements go a long way. There may be situations too where you have organizational swag. So be it t-shirts or mugs or just fun things where you can offer those to your board members who are volunteering their time and efforts and energy to the organization. And on occasion, if you do have the ability to buy gift cards and distribute them, I think that's certainly going to be appreciated. I just would use care to make sure that you're doing that with consistency and fairness, and you're not only giving gift cards to your favorite board members, but you're doing, providing that effort to those that in large are participating on the board. So what are some pro tips in this work? What I would share is that when communicating with board members, again, there's that kind of secondary tie to why we're having this conversation, so that we are reimbursing board members who may be contributing in certain ways with fairness and consistency. We want to make sure that we fill in the blanks. So if what's true is that, board members will be reimbursed or compensated in a certain way, then you want to make sure everybody knows that and that it's kind of out there in the open so that we don't have any assumptions going on. We also want to be able to support where the dollars went. This is very, very important, not just for bookkeeping and, those just kind of organizational things you must do, but you would never want to inadvertently have some type of situation that looked nefarious. You don't want a situation that looks as though you're favoring one person or even kind of serving people in a selfish way and not an organizational way. So making sure that you know where the receipts are, what those items went to, and that they were authorized and warranted is important. And then the other thing you want to do is you want to give shout outs where they're due and deserved. You want those board members and others that you work with in the organization to feel appreciated, to feel recognized. And so make sure you're giving shout outs when they are deserved. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this learning. To recap and to summarize, either the reminders or new information that you were provided today, you learned the difference categorically between an employee and an independent contractor. So remember, an employee is someone who typically is viewed as long-term or even indefinite. They are going to be participating in the organization's benefits. They're going to be on your payroll schedule. Whereas, and differently, a contractor is someone who could refuse the work, decline the work, may have other clients. They're going to be using their own supplies likely. And most of the time, contractors are not always indefinite. We're kind of using their services and their support and their expertise for a limited period of time or for a project or a season. You also learned all about the differences between compensation and reimbursement. Compensation is going to be for the time contributed to the organization. It's going to likely have deductions for taxes or, medical premiums or something like that. Whereas reimbursement is an employee or a board member or even a volunteer who went out and purchased something or paid for a service that serves the organization and needs to be compensated so that they don't incur any type of hardship for taking on that expense. It really is a organizational expense. It has to do with the work and someone else paid for it and just needs to be paid back. We learned a bit about considerations for board members, that truly transparency, regular communication is such a best practice. What are these board members expected to do? Are these volunteer roles or are they compensated? When would a board member be compensated? In the nonprofit world, those are usually somewhat more rare than in other situations that are not nonprofit. And then we learned a fair amount of pro tips in this work too. Well, thank you so much for participating in this training. Thank you for what you do in our communities, and I hope you have a really great day.